All right. After William Jefferson Clinton's 8 years in the presidency, his vice president, Al Gore, ran for president in the 2000 election against George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. It was a very important election, but first I want to, and obviously George W. Bush won, but first I want to look into his early life. Who was George W. Bush? He was the eldest of the six children of George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush. He grew up in Texas and went to an elite private school, Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, a boarding school. He also then got his degree from Yale University and went on to be a military pilot, a Navy military pilot in the Texas Air National Guard, and then a fighter pilot later on. And he graduated from Harvard Business School in 1973. After receiving his master's then from Harvard, he went back to Texas and started working in the Bush family business and got into an oil and gas industry and then started his own firm. He married Laura Welsh, who was a teacher and librarian, and they had two daughters. Then he tried to run for Congress in 78 but was unsuccessful, and so he concentrated on building up his business. He then helped out his dad in his political career, but also got together a bunch of business partners to buy the Texas Rangers, the baseball team of Texas. This gave him a little bit of notoriety and brought him to the public sphere as his own man, not just in the shadow of his father, and showed him to be a successful businessman. So he runs, as I said, in 2000 against Al Gore, the vice president of Clinton, and it ends up being one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Matter of fact, it was so close and so disputed that uh, they actually, because of voter fraud, etc., they actually asked for a recount in some of the counties that were really close and that would have swung or changed the votes of a state. Remember, when the majority, in general, when the majority of a state votes for a candidate, they're actually voting for the Electoral College, which are representatives for them to go then and vote for the candidate. So it's an indirect democracy. We remember that the founding fathers were very leery and weary of direct democracy. Well, this is kind of a complex form, but it had its purposes, it had its reasons. Now it's kind of lost a little bit of its significance, original significance, but it still functions in this way. So some states divide their votes, but the majority of states, if one candidate receives the majority in the state, all of the votes of that state go to that candidate. The votes of a particular state, you see on this map, there's numbers on each of the states. Those votes are calculated by the number of congressmen that the state has plus the number of senators. So you see the states that have three votes up there. That's their two senators and their one congressman, and then the as the population grew and the numbers grew, they get redistributed. So it depends on the moving in the population. Some states can then have more representatives when they do another census, and so the numbers of their votes change. But you can see the places that have large cities have very high numbers of votes. For example, New York with 33, that's basically and entirely thanks to the city of New York, and California, which has a number of major cities, has a very high population, and therefore they have very many electoral votes. So it ends up that there's a pretty difficult call on this election, but finally it is determined that Bush won and Al Gore conceded the victory. So Bush is in the presidency for a very short period of time. Let's think about it. The election is in 2000, so the presidents, after they're elected, they're inaugurated the January following the election. So he was inaugurated in January of 2001, and we have within the year September 11th. So immediately, this is going to shape the presidency of George W. Bush. This is going to outline this event is going to outline the rest of his presidency and everything that he does thereafter. So, what happens on September 11th? 19 terrorists in a group called Al Qaeda, um, under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, um, infiltrate the American airline system, passing with knives and box cutters, etc., getting into the planes, and they hijack 4 airplanes, one right after another. They're all going into the air around the same time, and they're all heading to the west coast. So they are huge airplanes with a lot of fuel. So they are going to be their bombs, if you will. Um, at 8:45 a.m. Tuesday morning, American Airlines Boeing 767, loaded with 20,000 gallons of jet fuel, crashes into the North Tower. And you can see in this picture that I've placed here, it crashes into the North Tower at a pretty high level. We're not talking about the plane, obviously, that's still in the air in the picture. We're talking about the building that's smoking. That's the North Tower. And it crashes into the North Tower at the 110th story, right? So it's pretty high up. The second plane, as you notice here in the picture, um, this happens about 18 minutes later. So already the first tower is starting to be evacuated. Already we have fire engines coming, emergency people on their way, and initially people are in shock. They think it could be an accident, that something could have gone wrong. There's a lot of confusion going on. They don't know what exactly happened, etc. 18 minutes later, a second Boeing 767 um, flies into the South Tower on the 60th floor. So the other one was on the 80th floor, the 110th story, and this one's on the 60th floor. You can see that it's lower than the other airplane where it hit, and this causes a massive explosion as well, and starts the burning of the second tower. Now, they continue to burn, and the steel starts to give way. There are many floors above the place of impact, as you can see, and so the weight of these floors that are above are going to start to weigh down on that floor where it's been hit and where there's this horrible fire that's going on, and the people above the floor that's hit are basically trapped. They can't get out. The entire floor, they're trapped. The entire floor is on fire, and everything's melting. They're not able to come down the fire escape routes. Um, the lower floors are being evacuated. Firefighters are trying to go up into the building to help people who are not able to get out, who are trapped, etc. And so there's huge rescue operations going on, lots of confusion. By the time they see the second plane go into the building, the South Tower, they realize this is not an accident. This is some sort of attack on the United States. Then, down in Washington, D.C., we have Flight 77, American Airlines, that leaves from Washington, D.C., and turns around and crashes into the Pentagon at 9:45 a.m. This creates an inferno in the Pentagon, and as some of the kids who had gone with us to Washington, D.C. saw, they saw the maps inside the Pentagon of how far this plane penetrated into this building, which is supposed to be basically impenetrable. And fortunately, the area was under renovations, and so few military personnel were killed, about 125 Um, Military and civilians were killed, along with the persons obviously on board the airline itself, 64 people. And everything started going into place. The military was on the move, um, and the news of the World Trade Center and now the Pentagon. No one knew how many other airplanes in the air at the time could be potential terrorist threats. And so immediately the air traffic control of the United States ordered the grounding of all flights. But this is a massive operation. You've got thousands and thousands of airlines in the air, and they all need to start coming down to different airports. It was a real moment of terror, and that was the purpose, right? A moment of terror, um, and confusion, because nobody knew what was going to happen next. Where was the next target? How many planes were involved? While all of this is going on, the World Trade Center, under the weight of the floors above, as I mentioned, and the inferno that was created by the explosion and the fuel of the airlines that crashed into the buildings, one after the other, the towers fall. Now, fortunately, I guess you could say, fortunately, the towers, almost miraculously, the top of the towers did not topple, and the towers did not fall um, sideways, which would have taken in many other buildings in the vicinity. But they fell directly straight down and just collapsed into dust. And it's pretty impressive, a huge, massive structure of that, you know, size to completely obliterate into rubble and dust. And that's what happens. And it's a steel structure, but it could not withstand the heat of the inferno that had been created. So at 10:30 a.m., the north building of the Twin Towers collapses, and only 6 people in the World Trade Center towers at the time of their collapse survive. About 10,000 others are treated for injuries. Overall, 9/11 cost the lives of about 3,000 people in these attacks. Fortunately, they were done early in the morning, so a lot of people had not even gotten to work yet. So the Trade Center actually was quite empty, as well as the Pentagon. Like I said, it was in a part of the Pentagon that was being renovated, etc. A lot of people were not at their desks, so this was fortunate in the long run. A fourth plane had been hijacked, United 93. Now, they had been delayed on the runway, and because of this, they were taking off after the attacks in New York and Washington D.C. And so they found out by cell phone and by airphones, they found out about these other attacks. When their plane was taken over by the hijackers, they realized that they were going to be used in the same way as these other flights. And so a number of brave passengers and crew of the flight decided to take over the airplane, knowing that they probably were not going to make it, knowing that their airplane was going to be used as a bomb to kill other people and destroy buildings. They decided that they were going to take the plane down and essentially give their lives to save whatever target they were destined for. And Todd Beamer is one of the famous guys, passengers, who they have a number of cell phones um, still open with their family members. And on one of the cell phones, we hear Todd Beamer and some of the others talking and saying, "Now's the time." And he says, "Are you guys ready? Let's roll." In other words, let's go, let's do it, let's take over, right? And that expression, "let's roll," has kind of become iconic for this United 93. Um, Basically, they gave their lives, for to save others, and so that phrase "let's roll" is iconic, and it represents their sacrifice to save people who they didn't know who was going to be the next target, but they knew that somebody was going to um, be the target of their airplane made into bomb. And they did end up overcoming the hijackers, and the plane took a turn to the ground and flipped over, and it headed towards the ground at about 500 miles per hour, crashing into Shanksville in western Pennsylvania at 10:10 a.m. All those on board were killed. As you can see the rubble, there's only the tail fin of the airplane that remained. There is nothing else of the airplane. It was completely obliterated. And no one knows what its target would have been, but there are a lot of speculations that it could have been the White House, the Capitol, or perhaps Camp David. But more likely the White House or the Capitol, being that they are symbols of American government and power. So, what does America do in response to these attacks? Um, President Bush at the time was in Florida. He was actually in a school listening to school children and talking about education, etc. He finds out about it. They move him immediately and get him in the air and get him out of that area. They move him around the country, trying to, for security reasons, trying to keep him safe. And finally, he gets back to the White House at 7 p.m. because they weren't sure if there were other airplanes around that were going to be smashed into the White House, for example. Once the things were under control and it seemed that everything was safe, all airplanes were grounded, etc., he was brought back to the White House, and he delivered a message from the Oval Office declaring America's resolve to find and bring to justice the people who were responsible for this terrorist attack. Pretty soon it became evident that it was Al Qaeda that was behind it, with Osama bin Laden as the perpetrator, and so America put into action Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7th, and they went into Afghanistan, which is where they were hiding and being protected by the Taliban regime, and they ended up overpowering them, but and driving them out. But it took a long time to completely defeat the Taliban insurgency groups. Um, After this whole situation, Bush's public approval ratings were the highest that they had ever been, reaching about 90% in the polls. So America was 100% behind these actions. Finally, the Al Qaeda was defeated, but Osama bin Laden evaded capture. And it wasn't until 2011, under um, Barack Obama, that he was found and killed by U.S. forces. And that brings the end to this episode. But this whole situation, like I said, this informs and this guides the rest of George W. Bush's presidency. Um, it makes him declare officially a war on terrorism, which is a difficult type of war because it's all over the place. Again, you're not dealing with armed, uniformed soldiers. It's not conventional warfare. Um, Terrorism is not a clear, cut and dried, black and white enemy. Um, and you can see on the map the rankings and the level of risks of terrorism in the different countries around the world. And so basically, American troops start getting sent around the world to different places of unrest, places where terrorism is manifesting itself, or places that have, in one way or the other, directly or indirectly threatened the United States or American citizens. It becomes a massive worldwide operation, which probably will never really see an end. Um, anyway, they pass in Congress, they pass the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act, Act, but it is commonly known as the USA Patriot Act. That's what it stands for. So nobody knows the whole title of it. We just call it the Patriot Act, which ends up giving broad surveillance and search powers to the FBI. This, as you can probably imagine from our studies of the individualism in America, etc., this is a highly contested and disputed piece of legislation. At the time, it passed because of obviously the threats that we were feeling in America, but at the same time, many Americans believed that it was a threat to their individual rights and liberties and their privacy. And so it's a very confrontational piece of legislation. Another major thing that happens at the time is the Bush decides that America needs to act preemptively, looking for potential military and terroristic threats that could be born in rogue nations that possess biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, known as weapons of mass destruction. This brings into the limelight Iraq, which at the time, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, uh, is suspected to be in possession of weapons of mass destruction and to have a program of development of these weapons. They did not cooperate, the Iraqis, with the UN inspection uh, group that had been sent there, and Bush tried to get together a coalition of Security Council members of the UN to authorize the use of force. Um, they were not able to get a sound resolution from everyone because France and Russia, for example, wanted to just continue with the weapons inspectors, trying to put on more pressure and everything, but Bush was not ready to wait and just sit by and let Iraq continue in their program. And so he put aside the diplomacy and he gave Saddam an ultimatum that within 48 hours he had to leave Iraq or he would face removal by force. Obviously, Saddam did not leave, and Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq called Operation Iraqi Freedom. This started the Iraq War, which lasted a very long time. The American troops were able to, and British troops, because Britain was in cohorts with the US, they were able to overcome Saddam's forces and the Iraqi forces pretty quickly and took over Baghdad. Um, but although Saddam's regime was overthrown, the country was in great upheaval, and so American forces had to stay for quite a long time to bring law and order and stability to the country. So it ended up being a very long, drawn-out um, operation, not the quick lightning plan of George W. Bush. And here I just put in some pictures of this this period in the Iraqi War and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Um, Looking quickly at the rest of Bush's domestic and foreign policies, mainly his aid policies, he promoted what he called compassionate conservatism. So he declared himself to be a conservative. He was Republican. He did not espouse the programs and the ideas of his predecessor, Clinton, but he considered himself a compassionate conservative, which in his mind meant that the government did have a larger role in helping out the less fortunate. And so in many ways he had a lot of liberal ideas in this sense. And he was ready to give foreign aid to countries that were demonstrating an openness to democracy and free enterprise and a transparency in their government. So this he put into action with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and he also got past Congress the Faith-Based Charities Initiative, which allowed government funding to be given to religious groups that helped with social services in poor communities, which previously they had not been able to obtain funds like any other group because of their religious affiliation. But he said some of the most important work is done by religiously affiliated groups, and there's no reason that they should not have equal access to federal fundings just because they espouse a religious faith. And then he put through for education the program No Child Left Behind Act, which would revolutionize education and basically bring it under the federal government even more than it had already been, with certain standards that became national standards. Um, and then he also created a task force to fight HIV and AIDS pandemic in 15 countries in Africa and the Caribbean. He also modernized the Medicare Act and brought more Americans under health insurance programs. So although Clinton's health insurance ideas had not gone forward, Bush was able to reform the entire system with this Modernization Act. So these are some of the main initiatives that he was able to get through during his presidency, um, apart from the two major um, defining moments of his presidency, which would be 9/11 and the War on Terror, and then obviously connected, related to this, is the war in Iraq. So this is a brief outline of his life. He does win the second election in 2004 against John Kerry. Again, it's a close election, but it shows the approval of the American people. And he appoints two Supreme Court justices to the court, John Roberts and Samuel Alito, who end up turning the court from up to four conservative justices on the 9-member Supreme Court, and now that's gotten up to 5 conservatives. So his inability, though, to bring a closure to the Iraq War, and his not good response to the Hurricane Katrina, which destroyed New Orleans. So the government's inability to handle these situations ended up bringing the Democrats into Congress, into control of Congress in the midterm elections of 2006. But in general, George W. Bush will be remembered for his leadership in the post 9/11 period of American history, and is considered to be a strong president who had been good for America at a time of great need. And so that's basically his legacy, 9/11 and the Iraqi War. And that's it.